Now, with that, we added lots of features to this form, more features than we added before with the template-driven approach, because as you can see, with the reactive forms approach, adding features like custom validators is super simple and straightforward. It's just a function we define and we then register and use. Now let's see how we would implement that feature where we saved the email address and pre-populated that form with it. And for that, here, I will now actually use onInit again. I could also use after next render again, but here I can also easily use ng-onInit because since I create my form here in my TypeScript class, I don't need to wait for the template to render for it to be initialized. Instead, it is initialized right from the start because I'm initializing it in code. That's another advantage of using the reactive forms approach. And therefore here in ng-onInit, we can start by setting up that subscription where we want to save the updated form in the browser local storage. And we do that just as before. We can use our form and then value changes, and then subscribe to this observable. Now we don't need a question mark here because now, since we're using reactive forms and we're setting up the form in our TypeScript code, TypeScript knows that it will be initialized and that we can safely set up this subscription. So then here I have my observer object and the next function where I get my value. And now again, because we set up everything in TypeScript, TypeScript understands what the value looks like and that it is an object of this shape in the end. So in here, I now in the end therefore wanna use my local storage to save this. And again, I'll name it saved login form. And I'll JSON stringify my value here, though I actually just want to save the email, so I'll set it up like this. That's how I can save this form with every keystroke. Now, just as before, I don't want to do it with every keystroke, so I will call pipe here and use debounce time, just as before with a timeout of 500 milliseconds. And debounce time, of course, is imported from RxJS. And we should also make sure that we clean up this subscription to make sure that it's never going on behind the scenes if it shouldn't be going on. So I'll store my subscription here in a constant. And just as before, I'll then also inject my destroy ref here with inject destroy ref like this. And then in ng-onInit, after setting up this subscription, we can register this onDestroy hook and then here clean up this subscription. With that, if we go to this application tab here again, you see if I reload, this is the initial value that's being saved. If I start typing here and then I stop at some point after 500 milliseconds, this is updated. So saving the value works. Now let's update the form with any saved value. And for that, in ng-onInit, just as before, we can of course get our saved form by accessing window local storage, get item, and by using this key here. And then just as before, I want to check if saved form is truthy. So if I found something there, and then I can get my loaded form by using JSON parse on that saved form. And of course, that will be an object of this shape. So an object with an email key. So we can therefore now reach out to our form here and again use setValue to update the overall form value. Or reach out to one of our controls and just set the value of that control. Or when using the reactive forms approach, you actually also have an alternative method you can use on the overall form, and that's the patch value method. This method is a method that exists if you want to partially update an overall form. And patch value then wants an object that can have the shape of your form, so the key value pairs you registered in your form. But I'm saying can because you can add as many key value pairs as you need. For example, here I can only set the email control. And now you set that to a new value, which could be a new string, a new empty string, or in my case, loaded form.email, which I know will be such a string value. And now patch value will make sure that only this control receives a new value and all the other controls will stay untouched. With that, if I save that and if I reload, this is still pre-populated. Now, if I delete saved login form from my local storage and I reload, you see we start with an empty form instead. But then again, we can start typing in there, this gets saved, and if we reload again, this is pre-populated. So that's now working the way it should. But since we're using the reactive forms approach, we could even load and populate our form in a different way. Instead of using this approach, which is absolutely fine, we could also load our content from local storage right when this file here is about to be executed. So totally detached from our component lifecycle. Let's say here, so outside of the component code. And we can parse the JSON content right below that line, also outside of the component code. Though now here TypeScript complains that saved form could be null, because we also need that if check, of course, to check if saved form is truthy. And we could then add a variable here, initial email value, which could be an empty string, but which I set to that loaded form email value, so to the email value stored in local storage if I have some stored value. And I'm doing all that here outside of the component because this code, of course, also will be executed when this file is executed for the first time in the browser. And now we can use this initial email value here and use that here as an initial value for this email control. And we can do that because we're doing the entire form setup here in our TypeScript code. Now, I will say that this will not work if you're doing some kind of server-side pre-rendering, and we'll get back to that in a later course section. But if you're not doing that, if you have a pure client-side application, this will work. And again, I'll get back to server-side pre-rendering later. But with that, if you save that, if you go back and reload, this all still works as before. This is still getting saved and pre-populated. This all works, but now even without relying on ng-oninit for loading the data, because we're doing all the setup work in TypeScript. So at this point, you learned a lot about reactive forms, but now we'll practice what we learned and also dive a bit deeper. That's why we also have this sign-up component. In there, you find a more complex form with more input elements and different input elements. And to see that form on the screen here, I'll actually go to the app component, and instead of outputting app login here, I'll output app sign-up and make sure that this gets imported into the app component. With that, that's the form you should see on the screen. And that's, of course, now a bit of a more complex form, which has more input elements, different input elements like a drop-down, a reset button, and so on. But we'll now set it up and manage it with help of reactive forms step by step. And along the way, we'll also learn about some new features. But first of all, I got a little exercise for you. I want you to make sure that this email here and this password here is managed by a reactive form. So you should create a reactive form with 2 inputs, and you should connect these inputs to the reactive form controls. And you should make sure that the sign up button works and the form you created is simply logged to the console. And you should also make sure that the reset button works and resets the form. If you're feeling fancy, you can also already try adding more inputs, though I will say you that will also soon add some nested form groups and so on, so you should be prepared to then also refactor some of that code. But still, you can try registering more inputs if you already want to play around with that. Otherwise, we'll do it together. And we'll start in the next lecture by registering email and password together, and by handling submission and resetting.